Obese girl paid $1 for a giant mountain man with a sack on his head at auction. That's what the town saw. They laughed. They pointed. But none of them knew what she really bought. Wasn't muscle or madness. It was the last man willing to stand with her. She's got a broken ranch, a mother who's losing hope, and a land baron ready to bury their family in railroad dust. Folks think she's too big, too soft, too foolish to fight back. But under that burlap sack is a secret the town's about to choke on. He ain't a brute. He's a witness. And the land they're trying to steal? It's been paid for, in blood and in promises. When the church bell tolls and the sheriff's keys jangle, one girl's courage and a single silver dollar will decide who owns this land and who burns with it. Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The morning sun beat down on the Dry Ridge auction yard as Nettie Jo Calhoun made her way through the dusty square. Her boots kicked up little clouds with each determined step. The silver dollar in her hand felt warm and smooth, worn from hours of worried rubbing. It was the last piece of money she had to her name. Whispers and snickers followed her progress. "Look who's come to town," someone muttered. "The Calhoun girl's got nerve showing her face here." Nettie Jo kept her chin high, though her cheeks burned. Her pa had taught her that dignity wasn't about what others thought of you. It was about staying true to what you knew was right. Still, the jeers stung like horseflies on a summer day. The auction platform loomed ahead, a weathered wooden stage where a line of indentured men stood waiting. Most were drifters or debtors, their eyes downcast as the auctioneer called out their merits to the crowd. But at the end of the line stood someone different, a giant of a man, so tall he seemed to scrape the sky. A rough burlap sack was tied over his head, and heavy iron shackles bound his wrists. "That one's dangerous, they say," a woman whispered loudly enough for Nettie Jo to hear. "Caught him up near Apache territory. Some kind of outlaw." The auctioneer, a weaselly man named Tate with a drooping mustache, spotted Nettie Jo approaching the platform. His thin lips curved into a mean smile. "Well, well, if it ain't Miss Calhoun herself, grace us with her presence." He swept his arm toward the giant. "Come to bid on our special offering, have you?" "This here beast's been passed over 3 times already." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nettie Jo's fingers tightened around her silver dollar. "How much?" she asked, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "For you?" Tate's eyes glinted with malice. "Why, seeing as you're such a fine lady of means, I reckon $1 silver might do it. That is, if you've got even that much to your name." More laughter, cruel and sharp. Nettie Jo stepped forward, her boots thudding on the wooden steps. Without a word, she placed her silver dollar on the auctioneer's table. The coin rang against the wood like a bell. Tate's smile faltered for just a moment. He hadn't expected her to actually do it. "Now see here," he began, but Nettie Jo cut him off. "That's legal tender," she said firmly, "and I want a proper receipt." The crowd had gone quiet now, watching the scene unfold with uneasy fascination. Tate glanced around, then forced a laugh. "Well, looks like the lady means business." He snatched up his gavel. $1 bid for the sackhead, going once, going twice. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. "Sold to Miss Calhoun." Nettie Jo stood her ground. "The receipt," she reminded him. Her voice didn't waver. Muttering under his breath, Tate scratched out a bill of sale on a scrap of paper. He thrust it at her with obvious distaste. Nettie Jo examined it carefully before tucking it into her pocket. Then she turned to the giant, who hadn't moved or made a sound throughout the entire exchange. "Come with me," she said quietly, reaching for the chain between his shackled hands. The crowd parted like water as she led him down from the platform, their whispers following in her wake. "She's gone plumb crazy. Just like her pa was. Gonna get herself killed." But Nettie Jo didn't look back. She walked straight and proud through the auction yard, the giant following docile as a lamb despite his fearsome appearance. Only when they reached the edge of the square did she pause, taking a deep breath of the dusty air. She'd done it. She'd spent her last dollar and bought herself a ranch hand that everyone else was afraid to touch. Maybe they were right about her being crazy. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of the chain in her hand and sensing the presence of the silent giant behind her, Nettie Jo knew she'd done exactly what her pa would have wanted. Sometimes doing right meant standing alone against the whole world's judgment. The morning sun caught the dust motes dancing around them, turning them to gold. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called, clear and sweet. Nettie Jo squared her shoulders and started walking again, leading her strange purchase away from the mockery of Dry Ridge toward whatever fate awaited them both. Nettie Jo led her silent companion down Dry Ridge's main street, the chain between them jangling with each step. The morning bustle slowed as folks stopped to stare. Women clutched their shawls tighter and hurried past. Men's hands drifted toward their belts, though none dared interfere with a legal sale. The giant's boots scraped against the packed dirt, following her lead without resistance. Through the rough weave of the sack, his breathing came steady and measured. Not the wild panting of some caged beast, Nettie Jo noted, but the patient rhythm of someone who knew how to wait. Outside the general store, Mrs. Whitaker's twins pressed their faces against the window glass, leaving smudgy prints as they gaped. Their mother yanked them back by their suspenders, shooting Nettie Jo a look that could curdle milk. "Ain't you got better things to do than gawk?" Nettie Jo called out, her voice carrying clear down the street. The twins disappeared behind a stack of flour sacks, but their mother's scowl remained fixed in place. The blacksmith shop squatted at the edge of town, smoke curling from its chimney like a lazy snake. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil grew louder as they approached. Nettie Jo squared her shoulders and marched straight to the wide doors, where Jake Turner was shaping a horseshoe with practiced swings. "Need these shackles removed," she announced, holding up the chain. Jake lowered his hammer slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead with a sooty forearm. His eyes darted between Nettie Jo and her towering companion. "Now, Miss Calhoun, I don't reckon that'd be wise." "He's my property, fair and square." Nettie Jo pulled out the receipt, its edges already soft from handling. "Paid good money for him at auction." Jake took the paper gingerly, as if it might bite. His lips moved as he read, brow furrowed. $1 ain't exactly. It's legal tender, and that's a legal sale." Nettie Jo's tone brooked no argument. "Now, are you going to help me, or do I need to ride all the way to Mesa Creek to find a blacksmith who will—" Jake's shoulders slumped. He knew as well as anyone that Mesa Creek was 3 days' hard ride, but the threat carried weight all the same. "All right, Miss Calhoun, bring him over to the anvil." The giant ducked his head to clear the doorframe, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. Jake selected a heavy pair of bolt cutters from his wall of tools, testing the edges with his thumb. "Hold still now," he muttered, positioning the cutters around the first shackle. The metal screamed as it gave way, sending sparks flying. Through the sack, Nettie Jo saw her companion's head jerk slightly at the sound. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the instinct of a man who'd learned to be wary of sudden movements. The second shackle fell away with another shower of sparks, clattering against the packed earth floor. "Much obliged," Nettie Jo said, dropping 2 copper pennies on Jake's workbench. He'd done the job without too much fuss, and that deserved fair payment. Outside, her wagon waited where she'd left it, the old mule dozing between the traces. The giant climbed up without being told, settling onto the rough wooden seat with careful movements. His wrists bore red marks where the shackles had been, but he made no move to rub them. They rattled past the last buildings of Dry Ridge, dust coating the wagon wheels. When the town had shrunk to nothing more than a smudge on the horizon, Nettie Jo pulled the mule to a stop. Without ceremony, she reached up and sliced through the rope holding the sack in place. The burlap fell away, revealing a face weathered by sun and hardship. A thick beard shot through with gray couldn't hide the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, but it was his eyes that caught Nettie Jo's attention, Deep-set and tired, they held none of the savagery the townsfolk had whispered about. Instead, they studied her with quiet wariness, like a wild creature trying to decide if she meant harm. "Name's Nettie Jo Calhoun," she said, reaching into her wagon bag. She pulled out a thick slab of cornbread wrapped in clean muslin, offering it without hesitation. "You work for me now." The man's large hands, rough with calluses, accepted the cornbread carefully. His voice, when it finally came, was low and rusty from disuse. "Bram McKinnon." "Well then, Bram McKinnon." Nettie Jo picked up the reins again. "Reckon we best get home before dark." The wagon creaked along the dusty trail, each wooden wheel finding every rut and stone. Bram McKinnon sat beside Nettie Jo, his large frame making the wagon seat groan. He hadn't touched the cornbread she'd offered, letting it rest in his calloused hands instead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and dust devils danced in the distance. "Mom," Bram finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse, "you bought yourself a heap of trouble today." Nettie Jo kept her eyes on the trail ahead, guiding the horses around a deep rut. "Reckon I'll be the judge of that, Mr. McKinnon." "Army Scout, that's what I was," he continued, breaking off a small piece of cornbread. "Till I saw what those bounty hunters were doing to Apache women and children. Couldn't stand by." His jaw tightened. "Made my choice." "The wanted posters say you killed those hunters," Nettie Jo said quietly. "No, Mom. Warned them off first. When they wouldn't listen, I helped their intended victims escape." He paused, studying the crumbling cornbread in his fingers. "But a man who stands between hunters and their bounty might as well be an outlaw in these parts." Nettie Jo nodded, taking in his words without comment. The wagon rolled past a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. "My pa believed in doing what's right, even when folks called him wrong." The sun was setting when they finally crested the last hill. Below them lay the Calhoun Ranch, a weathered two-story house with a tin roof that caught the dying light. The barn listed to one side like a tired old man, and the windmill above the well stood silent, its blades still against the darkening sky. "It ain't much," Nettie Jo admitted, "but it's home." Bram's eyes took in every detail. "Well, needs work," he observed. "Barn, too." "Everything needs work," she replied, steering the wagon into the yard. "That's why you're here." A lamp flickered to life in the house window, and the front door opened. Miriam Calhoun stepped onto the porch, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl. The color drained from her face when she saw Bram, but she pressed her lips together and said nothing. "Mama!" Nettie Jo called out, climbing down from the wagon. "This here's Mr. McKinnon. He's come to help with the ranch." Miriam's eyes darted between her daughter and the giant man now standing in their yard. "Nettie Jo Calhoun," she whispered. "What have you done?" "What needed doing, Mama?" Nettie Jo's voice was firm but gentle. "We can't manage alone anymore." Inside the house, lamplight cast warm shadows on the worn tablecloth as Miriam set out 3 tin plates. The aroma of bean soup and fresh biscuits filled the small kitchen. Bram had to duck to clear the doorframe, and the wooden chair creaked beneath his weight. "We aim to fix the well first," Nettie Jo announced, passing the biscuit basket. "Then the barn roof before winter comes. Mr. McKinnon knows ranch work, and he's strong enough to do what Pa used to." Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she ladled soup into the bowls. "The neighbors will talk," she said softly. "Let them," Nettie Jo replied. "They talk anyway." Bram sat quietly, his spoon looking tiny in his massive hand. "Mom," he addressed Miriam, "I know what it looks like having me here, but I give you my word, I mean no harm to you or your daughter." Miriam studied him for a long moment, then bowed her head. "Lord," she prayed, her voice steady despite her fears, "bless this food to our use, and bless this house, and all who dwell within it. Amen." "Amen," Nettie Jo echoed firmly. Bram's amen was barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet kitchen, it seemed to seal a covenant between them all. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the distant cry of a coyote. Through the window, stars began to appear in the purple dusk, twinkling like silver dollars scattered across heaven's auction yard. The same stars that had witnessed Nettie Joe's bold purchase now watched over this unlikely supper, where an outlaw scout shared bread with a widow and her daughter, and hope began to take root in barren soil. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Nettie Joe stirred a pot of thick oatmeal over the cook stove. The kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and frying salt pork. Through the window, she spotted Bram's tall figure already moving along the corral fence, studying the broken sections with careful attention. Nettie Joe spooned the oatmeal into 3 bowls, adding a drizzle of precious molasses to each. She wrapped 4 biscuits in a clean cloth, tucked the salt pork between them, and headed outside. The morning air held a hint of autumn crispness, making her pull her shawl tighter. "Mr. McKinnon," she called out, approaching the corral. "Brought you some breakfast." Bram straightened from his inspection of a rotted post. "Much obliged," he said, accepting the bundle. His eyes were clearer this morning, less haunted. "Your fence line's seen better days. Posts are loose, crossbeams splitting, whole south section needs replacing." Nettie Joe nodded, surveying the damage. Pa meant to fix it last spring, before the fever took him. She squared her shoulders. "I'll fetch the planks from the barn." "That's man's work," Bram protested, but something in Nettie Joe's steady gaze made him fall silent. "It's work that needs doing," she replied simply, "and I've got 2 good arms, same as you." Together, they fell into a rhythm. Bram leveraged his strength to pull out the old posts, while Nettie Joe hauled fresh lumber from the barn. The morning sun climbed higher as they worked, their breaths creating small clouds in the cool air. Bram's powerful swings with the sledgehammer drove new posts deep into the earth, while Nettie Joe steadied each one, her hands sure and capable. The clip-clop of approaching hooves broke their concentration. Deputy Thorne rode up on his dappled mare, his badge catching the sunlight. The deputy's face wore an expression of discomfort as he dismounted, clutching an official-looking envelope. "Morning, Miss Calhoun," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes flickered uncertainly to Bram, who had straightened to his full height, sledgehammer still in hand. "Deputy Thorne," Nettie Joe acknowledged, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you out our way?" Thorne cleared his throat. "Official business, I'm afraid." He held out the envelope. "Mr. Trumbull, representing the railroad company, has filed a claim on this property. Says the land deed's unclear, what with your father's passing and all." Nettie Joe's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Pa's papers are all proper and filed at the county seat." "Maybe so," Thorne said, shifting his weight. "But Mr. Trumbull's lawyers say different. This here's notice of eviction. You've got 2 weeks to either clear out or present proof of ownership that'll stand up in court." Bram's grip on the sledgehammer tightened, but Nettie Joe stepped forward calmly. She took the envelope with steady hands, her face betraying no fear. "Much obliged for riding all the way out to deliver this, Deputy," she said politely. "We'll have our papers ready when the time comes." Thorne's expression softened slightly. "Look here, Miss Calhoun. I knew your pa. He was a good man. But Trumbull's got his heart set on this land for the railroad, and he's got friends in high places." "So did my father," Nettie Joe replied quietly. And his word was as solid as any track that railroad might lay. The deputy nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. He mounted his horse, paused, then added in a lower voice, "Trumbull's been buying up water rights all through the territory. Might want to check your pa's papers on that too." After Thorne rode away, Nettie Joe stood still, the envelope clutched in her hand. The morning breeze rustled through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. 2 weeks ain't much time, Bram observed carefully. "No," Nettie Joe agreed, "but it's what we've got." She tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and picked up another plank. Best get this corral finished first. Can't fight for a ranch that's falling apart. Bram studied her for a moment, noting the determined set of her chin, the strength in her stance. Without another word, he lifted the sledgehammer and returned to work. The rhythmic sound of hammering filled the morning air once more, each blow a defiant answer to Trumble's threat. Inside the house, Miriam watched through the window, one hand pressed to her heart, the other clutching her worn Bible. The morning sun caught the silver threading through her hair as she whispered a quiet prayer for strength, for guidance, and for the determination she saw burning in her daughter's eyes. Nettie Jo knelt before her father's old trunk in the attic, dust motes dancing in the beam of sunlight that streamed through the small window. The leather-bound chest creaked as she lifted the heavy lid, releasing the familiar scent of tobacco and old paper that always reminded her of Pa. Through the floorboards came the steady thump of Miriam's rolling pin downstairs, working out biscuit dough for lunch. Outside, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal marked Bram's progress at the well, where he'd been working since sunrise. "Has to be here somewhere," Nettie Jo muttered, carefully lifting out stacks of documents. Her father had been meticulous with his paperwork, everything sorted and tied with twine. Land surveys, cattle records, letters from back east. She set each bundle aside with reverent care. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a packet of papers that felt different from the rest. The pages were older, the edges softened with age. As she unfolded them, her breath caught. The first page bore her father's bold signature, alongside unfamiliar marks she recognized as Apache symbols. A shadow fell across the attic floor. "Child!" Miriam called up the ladder. "Sister Fawn is here." Nettie Jo gathered the papers carefully and descended. In the kitchen stood Sister Fawn, her silver hair bound in traditional Apache style, her bearing as dignified as any queen's. Though her face was lined with years, her dark eyes were sharp and alert. "Young Calhoun," Sister Fawn greeted her, using the formal address that acknowledged Nettie Jo as her father's heir. "Word travels fast through desert winds. The railroad man moves against your land." Nettie Jo nodded, clutching the discovered papers. "Yes, Mum, but I've found something. Pa's papers about the land. There's markings here I don't recognize." Sister Fawn's eyes widened slightly at sight of the documents. She gestured to the kitchen table, and they sat together, Miriam hovering nearby with coffee cups and concern etched on her face. The steady clanging from the well stopped. Moments later, Bram's tall frame filled the doorway, his shirt dark with sweat from his morning's labor. He hung back, uncertain, until Nettie Jo motioned him inside. Sister Fawn spread the papers reverently on the table. "This is the treaty your father made with our people," she explained, her finger tracing the Apache symbols. "Here, the mark of flowing water. Here, the promise of shared springs." She looked up at Nettie Jo. "Your father understood that water belongs to no one man. He promised to protect the sacred spring that feeds both our lands." "Sacred spring?" Nettie Jo leaned forward. "But our well's gone dry." Sister Fawn's expression hardened. "The well is not the only water source on your land. There is an ancient spring, hidden in the rocks beyond your north pasture. Trumble's men have been asking questions about it." Bram spoke up from his place by the door. "That's what this is really about then. Not the railroad, the water rights." "The railroad needs water for its steam engines," Miriam said softly. "Miles and miles of track through desert land." Nettie Jo studied the treaty, her father's signature bold and clear beside the tribal marks. "This is legal. It would stand up in court. Your father registered it proper with territorial authorities." Sister Fawn confirmed. "But Trumble's kind, they do not honor paper signed with Indian marks. They will fight it." "Then we'll fight back." Nettie Jo's voice was quiet but firm. "Pa gave his word. That means something." Sister Fawn's weathered hand covered Nettie Jo's. "You have your father's heart, young Calhoun, but this path will not be easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Nettie Jo replied. She looked around the kitchen. at her mother's worried face, at Bram's steady presence, at Sister Fawn's dignified strength. "We'll ride into town tomorrow. Present these papers proper, like Pa would have done." Bram shifted, his voice gruff with concern. "Want me to come along?" Nettie Jo met his eyes. "Yes, reckon I do." Sister Fawn rose, her movement graceful despite her years. "I will gather our elders. They must speak for the treaty too." She paused at the door, looking back at Nettie Jo. "Your father said you were named for the summer evening star, bright and steady in the darkening sky. He chose well." After Sister Fawn departed, silence filled the kitchen. Miriam busied herself with the coffee cups, while Bram shifted uncomfortably, leaving dusty boot prints on the clean floor. "I'd best get back to that well," he said finally. "Might be we can get water flowing again before tomorrow." Nettie Jo watched him go, then carefully folded the treaty papers. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now she had work to do. She had her father's word to uphold, and that was foundation enough to build on. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Nettie Jo hitched the horses to their old wagon. The morning air held a bite of autumn chill, making the horses' breath steam in white puffs. Bram worked alongside her in silence, his large hands checking each strap and buckle with careful precision. Sister Fawn arrived just as they finished, riding side saddle on a painted pony. Her silver hair was bound in traditional braids, and she wore her finest wool shawl, the one reserved for tribal councils. The sight of her dignified bearing strengthened Nettie Jo's resolve. "Ready?" Nettie Jo asked, patting the treaty papers tucked safely in her coat pocket. Both Bram and Sister Fawn nodded, and they set out for Dry Ridge. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they traveled, kicking up dust along the rutted road. Bram sat beside Nettie Jo on the driver's bench, his presence solid and reassuring. Sister Fawn rode alongside, her back straight as an arrow, while her pony's hooves marked time with the wagon team. As they approached town, the morning bustle of Dry Ridge slowed to a halt. Store owners paused in sweeping their boardwalks. Women gathering at the water pump fell silent. Children stopped their play to stare. The clip-clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Nettie Jo kept her chin high, guiding the wagon toward the town council hall. She could feel the weight of every stare, hear the whispers that followed their progress. A group of men lounging outside the saloon straightened up, their faces hard with disapproval at the sight of Sister Fawn. Bram's jaw tightened as he helped Nettie Jo down from the wagon. His eyes scanned the growing crowd, watching for trouble. Sister Fawn dismounted with quiet grace, ignoring the mutters that rippled through the onlookers. The council hall doors stood open, sunlight streaming across worn floorboards. Inside, the town's leading men had already gathered. Ranchers, merchants, and at the head of the long table, banker Oswald Trumbull. His neat suit and gold watch chain marked him as different from the others, a man of paper and numbers rather than dust and cattle. Judge Morrison sat beside him, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression already set in lines of dismissal. The room smelled of pipe smoke and leather, of men who made decisions that shaped other people's lives. Nettie Jo walked to the center of the room, conscious of every creak of her boots on the wooden floor. She drew out the treaty papers, unfolding them with steady hands despite her racing heart. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong like her father had taught her. "I'm here about the eviction notice served to the Calhoun Ranch." Trumbull's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Calhoun, this is a simple matter of progress. The railroad needs water," Nettie Jo cut in, holding up the treaty. "And that's what this is really about. This here's a legal treaty, signed by my father and the Apache elders, witnessed and registered with territorial authorities. It binds the sacred spring on our land to shared use between our family and the White Mountain Apache people." She began reading aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the now crowded room. The words spoke of honor and obligation, of water rights and sacred trust. Sister Fawn stood like a statue, her presence lending weight to every line. Trumbull's laugh cut through the final words. A piece of hearsay paper, marked with Indian scratches. Surely you jest, Miss Calhoun. Those marks, Sister Fawn spoke for the first time, are the signatures of our tribal elders. They carry the weight of our nation's promise. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. This council cannot recognize such a document as legally binding. The territory's development cannot be held hostage by irregular agreements. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Nettie Jo saw uncertainty in some faces, shame in others. A few of the older ranchers shifted uncomfortably, remembering perhaps their own handshake deals with her father. My father's word was his bond, Nettie Jo said, her voice tight with emotion. He believed in doing right by all his neighbors, no matter their race or station. This treaty is legal and true, and you know it. The matter is closed, Trumbull declared, standing. The eviction stands. Progress cannot be stopped by childish sentimentality. Nettie Jo carefully refolded the treaty, her cheeks burning, but her spine straight. The crowd parted before her as she walked out, Sister Fawn and Bram flanking her like honor guards. Outside in the harsh sunlight, Nettie Jo's hands trembled as she climbed back into the wagon. The watching crowd had grown, their whispers following like autumn leaves in the wind. Bram helped Sister Fawn mount her pony before joining Nettie Jo on the wagon seat. As they started the long ride home, he spoke quietly. This fight ain't lost yet, Miss Nettie. You planted seeds back there, saw it in their faces? Nettie Jo nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. She'd done what she came to do, stood up, and spoke truth in the face of power. The rest would have to wait for another day. The morning sun beat down on Nettie Jo's shoulders as she guided her horse along the dusty trail to the reservation agency. The small wooden building sat isolated on the outskirts of Dry Ridge, its weathered sign barely legible against the bleached boards. A lone American flag hung limp in the still air. Inside, the office smelled of old paper and tobacco. Behind a scratched desk sat Agent Harrison Fuller, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He barely looked up from his ledger as Nettie Jo approached. Miss Calhoun, he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. What brings you to my office? Nettie Jo placed the treaty on his desk. Sir, I need your help. This document proves our land can't be seized without breaking Apache water rights. Fuller glanced at the paper, then pushed it away with one finger as if it might bite. I'm afraid I can't get involved in private property disputes. But this involves tribal rights, Nettie Jo pressed. Surely the agency has some duty to— The railroad's influence reaches far beyond Dry Ridge, Fuller interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. My position here is precarious. I suggest you find another way to resolve this matter. Nettie Jo's throat tightened with frustration, but she kept her voice steady. Much obliged for your time, sir. She gathered up the treaty and walked out, letting the door bang shut behind her. The church stood at the other end of town, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way home. Preacher Eldon Maris was tending his small garden when Nettie Jo rode up, his suspenders dusty from work. Well, if it ain't Thomas Calhoun's girl, he said warmly, straightening up from his tomato plants. Been watching your struggle with interest, child. Nettie Jo dismounted, leading her horse to the hitching post. Preacher, I need your counsel. Pa always said you were a man who stood for right, no matter the cost. Maris gestured toward the church steps. They sat together in the shade, while Nettie Jo explained everything. The treaty, Trumbull's threats, the agency's refusal to help. The preacher listened intently, his weathered face thoughtful. Your father was a righteous man, Maris said when she finished. He understood that God's love knows no boundaries of race or station. That treaty represents a sacred promise, not just a legal one. But how can we fight the railroad? Nettie Jo asked, twisting her hands in her lap. Maris's eyes sparked with determination. The pulpit carries weight in this town. Next Sunday, I'll speak on broken promises and the sin of stealing water from the thirsty. Moreover, I'll stand with you publicly. Let Trumbull try to dismiss both moral and legal right." Relief washed over Nettie Jo like cool water. "Thank you, preacher. Pa would be proud to see you taking this stand." "Your pa taught me a thing or two about courage," Maris replied, patting her shoulder. "Now go on home. Your mama will be wondering where you are." The afternoon sun was sinking towards the hills when Nettie Jo rode into the ranch yard. The sound of hammering drew her to the barn, where she found Bram perched on the roof, replacing worn shingles with practiced efficiency. Below, to her surprise, stood her mother. Miriam watched intently as Bram demonstrated how to brace a loose door hinge, his deep voice carrying instructions about proper angle and pressure. A basket of fresh biscuits sat nearby, evidence of her mother's gratitude for the lesson. "See here, Mrs. Calhoun," Bram was saying. "You want to set the screws just so. Make sure they bite deep into the wood." Miriam nodded. Her usually worried face relaxed into concentration. "I never knew there was such art to it. My Thomas always handled these things." "A ranch needs constant mending," Bram replied. No shame in learning how. His serious expression softened into a rare smile as he caught sight of Nettie Jo. "Well, look who's home," Miriam called out. "Come see what Mr. McKinnon's teaching me about barn repairs." Nettie Jo joined them, warmth spreading through her chest at the sight of her mother and Bram working together. Something had shifted between them, the initial fear replaced by cautious trust. "Bram's showing me how to keep this place standing," Miriam explained, her eyes bright with new purpose. "Says even I can manage some of the simpler fixes." "Your mother's a quick study," Bram added, climbing down from the roof. "Reckon she could teach me a thing or two about determination." Nettie Jo shared her news about Preacher Maris, watching hope bloom on her mother's face. As they walked together toward the house for supper, she felt the bonds between them strengthening like well-set nails in solid wood. The evening light painted the barn gold, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called its evening song. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, Nettie Jo felt truly hopeful. They weren't just three people fighting alone anymore. They were becoming a family, and their circle of allies was growing. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the ink-black sky when the first rock sailed through Nettie Jo's bedroom window. Glass shattered across the floor as hoarse shouts and pounding hooves filled the night air. She bolted upright, heart hammering against her ribs. "Nettie Jo!" Miriam's voice carried from down the hall. "Stay inside!" But Nettie Jo was already pulling on her boots. Through the broken window, she saw shadowy figures circling the corral, their faces hidden beneath dark bandanas. The crack of splintering wood echoed across the yard as they took sledgehammers to the fence posts. Bram's heavy footsteps thundered down the porch steps. "Clear off this land!" His voice boomed across the yard. One of the raiders answered with a warning shot that kicked up dust near his feet. Nettie Jo rushed downstairs, finding her mother clutching her father's old shotgun. "Mama, we need to—" A bright orange glow caught her eye through the kitchen window. Flames licked up the barn's wooden walls, hungry tongues of fire reaching for the roof. The horses inside whinnied in panic. "The barn!" Nettie Jo cried out. She grabbed 2 empty buckets and ran for the well, her mother close behind. Outside, chaos erupted. Bram grappled with 2 raiders near the corral, his massive frame throwing one man clear over the broken fence. Another swung a club at his head, but Bram caught it mid-strike and wrenched it away. "The water pump!" Miriam shouted, already working the handle. "Quick now!" Nettie Jo positioned her bucket under the spout as her mother pumped. The raiders' horses reared and stomped, adding to the mayhem. Through the commotion, she heard Bram's grunt of pain as a blow caught him in the shoulder. "Keep that bucket line moving," Nettie Jo commanded, racing towards the barn. Heat blasted her face as she threw the first bucket of water at the base of the flames. Behind her, Miriam was already filling the second bucket. Back and forth they ran, mother and daughter, while Bram drove the raiders back. the night filled with steam and smoke, making their eyes water and throats burn. Their arms ached from carrying bucket after bucket, but neither woman slowed their pace. "Ain't worth dying for, McKinnon," one of the raiders shouted as Bram sent another sprawling. "Trumbull says this land's getting cleared one way or another." "Tell Trumbull he'll have to do better than hired thugs," Bram growled back, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. The raiders finally retreated, their horses' hooves thundering into the darkness. But the barn still burned, threatening to collapse. Nettie Jo's lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand, yet she kept running between well and barn, determined to save what remained of their livelihood. Dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in weary shades of pink and grey. Slowly, the last flames died under their relentless assault. The barn stood, charred but not destroyed, its blackened beams a testament to their determination. Nettie Jo sank to her knees in the mud, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. Beside her, Miriam leaned against the well, her face streaked with soot and tears. Bram limped over, his shirt torn and bloodied, but his eyes fierce with protective pride. "You two fought like warriors," he said softly, helping Nettie Jo to her feet. "They meant to drive us out," Miriam whispered, staring at the damaged barn. "To frighten us away from our own land." Nettie Jo straightened her spine, despite her body's protests. "Then they don't know the Calhouns very well. This calls for a public reckoning. No more hiding in the shadows. Trumbull needs to answer for this in broad daylight." They spent the rest of the day rebuilding what they could. Bram replaced the broken fence posts, while Nettie Jo and Miriam cleared away the charred debris. The work was slow and painful, their bodies still aching from the night's battle, but each repaired board felt like an act of defiance. Late in the afternoon, Nettie Jo paused to rest her blistered hands. The barn's scorched beams rose against the sky like battle scars, telling their story of resistance. She watched her mother carefully nail a loose board back into place, her movements sure despite her fatigue. Nearby, Bram worked steadily, his injured shoulder not slowing his progress. "You know what Pa used to say?" Nettie Jo said, passing a canteen to her mother. "Sometimes the Lord tests our metal by fire." Miriam took a slow drink, then smiled grimly. "Well, we surely got tested last night, and we're still standing." "That we are, Mama." Nettie Jo looked at their day's work. The mended fence, the reinforced walls, the cleared ground ready for new beginnings. "That we surely are." 2 mornings after the barn burning, Nettie Jo stood at the kitchen window, watching Bram repair the last of the scorched beams. The early sunlight caught the silver threads in his beard as he worked, his movements careful despite his healing shoulder. A cloud of dust on the road caught her attention, Deputy Thorne's horse approaching at a steady trot. "Mama?" she called softly. "We've got company?" Miriam looked up from her mending, her fingers stilling on the torn shirt. Through the window, they watched Deputy Thorne dismount, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a heavy burden. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, straightening it with trembling hands. "McKinnon," Thorne called out, his voice strained. "Got a warrant here. You're under arrest for assault on Marcus Weber last night at the Silver Dollar Saloon." Bram set down his hammer, wiping his hands slowly on his trousers. "Reckon that's peculiar, seeing as I've been here all night fixing this barn." Nettie Jo burst through the screen door, Miriam close behind. "That's a lie. Bram hasn't left the ranch since the raid." "I know," Thorne said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "But Weber's got 3 witnesses saying different, and Trumbull's pushing for immediate arrest." Bram's eyes met Nettie Jo's, a silent message passing between them. She recognized the calm in his gaze. He was choosing this, giving her time to work without watching over his safety. "I'll come peaceful," Bram said, holding his wrists out. "No need for those irons, Deputy. You have my word." Thorne's relief was visible as he nodded, tucking the shackles back in his saddlebag. "Much obliged, McKinnon." As Bram walked toward the deputy's horse, Nettie Jo stepped forward. "We'll get this sorted," she said firmly. "You just keep your head up." Always do, Miss Nettie, Bram replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. They watched until horse and riders disappeared into the shimmering heat waves. Miriam squeezed her daughter's shoulder. What now, child? Nettie Joe's jaw set with determination. Now we gather our friends. Trumbull wants to play with the law? Well, two can manage that game. Within the hour, they were hitching up the wagon. Their first stop was the Apache settlement, where Sister Fawn listened gravely to their news. The elder woman's dark eyes flashed with anger at Trumbull's latest move. He thinks by caging the strong one, he breaks your spirit, Sister Fawn said, gathering her shawl. He does not understand that strength flows like water through many channels. Their next visit was to Preacher Maris's small church on the outskirts of town. The preacher paced his study as Nettie Joe explained their situation, his weathered face growing stormy. The Lord's house stands for truth, he declared, reaching for his hat. We'll hold an assembly tonight. Time folks heard the whole story, not just Trumbull's version. Word spread quietly through town. The baker's wife, who'd lost her lease to Trumbull's schemes. The schoolteacher, whose brother's farm had been seized for unpaid taxes. The blacksmith who'd removed Bram's shackles that first day. One by one, they slipped into the church as evening shadows lengthened. Back at the ranch, Miriam was searching through her husband's old strongbox when she found it, the silver dollar receipt from the auction, carefully preserved. Her hands shook as she read the formal script declaring Bram McKinnon legally contracted to the Calhoun Ranch. Nettie Joe, she called, hurrying to where her daughter prepared for the meeting. Look what I kept safe. Nettie Joe took the paper, her eyes widening as she read. Mama, this proves Bram's our legal employee. He couldn't have been in town causing trouble. He's bound by contract to our land. The church pews filled slowly as dusk settled over Dry Ridge. Preacher Maris stood at his pulpit, Sister Fawn beside him, her presence lending gravity to the gathering. Nettie Joe clutched the receipt in her pocket, drawing strength from the simple proof of ownership. Folks, she began, her voice clear in the hushed sanctuary. You know me. You knew my father. We've never asked for more than honest treatment and the right to work our land in peace. She told them everything, the treaty protecting Apache water rights, Trumbull's threats, the barn burning, and now Bram's false arrest. Sister Fawn spoke of broken promises and sacred springs. The preacher reminded them of Scripture's words about justice and bearing false witness. One by one, others stood to share their own stories of Trumbull's corruption. The baker's wife wept as she described losing her shop. The school teacher's careful records showed impossible tax calculations. And now, Nettie Joe finished, holding up the auction receipt. We have proof that Bram McKinnon is legally contracted to our ranch. He couldn't have been in town last night. The law itself binds him to our land. A murmur ran through the assembly. It wasn't just about one ranch anymore, or one falsely accused man. It was about their town, their homes, their dignity in the face of greed's slow poison. As the meeting continued, plans began to form. The school teacher would examine town records. The preacher would write to the territorial governor. Sister Fawn would bring tribal elders to testify about the treaty. Nettie Joe felt hope rising in her chest, as sturdy as a new fence post. They weren't alone anymore. Trumbull had finally pushed too far, and Dry Ridge was starting to push back. Dawn painted the jail's barred windows with strips of pale gold as Nettie Joe waited for Deputy Thorne to unlock the heavy door. The metal hinges creaked, echoing through the quiet building. Inside, Bram sat on a narrow cot, his large frame making the cell seem even smaller than it was. Morning, Miss Nettie, he said softly, standing as she approached the bars. His beard was untrimmed, but his eyes held their usual steady calm. Brought you some fresh bread, she said, passing a cloth-wrapped bundle through the bars. Mama baked it special this morning. Bram's weathered hands took the package carefully. Much obliged. Your mama's kindness means a fair bit. Deputy Thorne shifted uncomfortably at his desk, pretending to focus on his morning coffee. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each precious moment. "The town's starting to wake up," Nettie Jo said quietly, her fingers wrapped around the cold iron bars. "Last night at the church meeting, folks shared stories about Trumbull. Seems we're not the only ones he's wronged." Bram nodded, settling back on his cot. "Man like that, his sins catch up eventually. Just got to stay steady, let truth do its work." "But what if the trial—" Nettie Jo's voice caught. "Listen here." Bram leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You've got more fight in you than any 10 men I've known. Don't let doubt creep in now. Stay the course." A shaft of sunlight caught the dust motes dancing between them, and Nettie Jo felt strength flowing back into her spirit. Bram's faith in her meant something bigger than fear or doubt. As she turned to leave, her eye caught movement on the sheriff's desk. Papers scattered carelessly across the wooden surface, official letterhead visible among the clutter. Court records, she realized, left out in plain sight. Deputy Thorne had stepped outside for his morning smoke, leaving her alone in the front office. Moving quietly, Nettie Jo glanced at the topmost document. Her heart jumped. It was a property deed with Trumbull's signature, the ink slightly smeared. Below it lay another deed with his name, but the signature looked different, more carefully drawn. She memorized the details quickly, her mind racing. If Trumbull had been forging documents, surely his signatures wouldn't match across all these papers. The evidence was right here, waiting to be found. "Miss Nettie." Thorne's voice came from the doorway. She stepped back from the desk smoothly. "Just leaving, Deputy." "Much obliged for the visit." The autumn sun was high when Nettie Jo returned home, her mind full of plans. She spent the afternoon in her father's study, pulling out every piece of paperwork they had with Trumbull's signature, loan notices, tax receipts, threatening letters. She spread them across the old oak desk, comparing each flowing line. Miriam brought her daughter tea and cornbread as the afternoon light faded to evening. "What are you seeing, child?" "Look here, Mama." Nettie Jo pointed to 2 documents. "These signatures, they're too perfect, too alike. A real signature has natural variations, but these look traced, like someone copying carefully." The lamp burned low as Nettie Jo organized her evidence, making careful notes about dates and differences. A knock at the door startled them both. Sister Fawn stood on the porch, wrapped in a dark shawl. Behind her, 3 Apache elders waited solemnly. 2 Rivers, Mountain Hawk, and Grey Wolf, their faces weathered with wisdom. "We come to speak truth," Sister Fawn said simply, gesturing to the elders. "About the sacred spring, about your father's promise, about the old ways that must be honored." Nettie Jo welcomed them into the parlor, where Miriam served coffee in their best cups. 2 Rivers, the eldest, spoke first in Apache, with Sister Fawn translating his measured words. "The spring has been holy ground since before white men came," she interpreted. "Your father understood this. He made a promise, not just on paper, but to the land itself." Mountain Hawk added his testimony about the treaty signing, describing details only someone present could have known. Grey Wolf spoke of the spring's healing properties and its importance to both settlers and tribal people. "We will speak at trial," Sister Fawn concluded. "Our words will stand against Trumbull's lies." Nettie Jo showed them her discoveries about the forged signatures. The elders examined the papers carefully, their expressions growing grave as they understood the depth of Trumbull's deception. "Truth flows like water," Sister Fawn said, touching one of the false signatures. "It finds its way past any barrier." As the elders prepared to leave, 2 Rivers placed his hand on Nettie Jo's shoulder, speaking directly to her this time. Sister Fawn translated, "You have your father's heart. Strong, like the mountains. True, like the stars. We stand with you." Nettie Jo watched them disappear into the darkness, their quiet dignity adding weight to her purpose. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing their case for Bram's trial. With the forged signatures, the Apache elders' testimony, and the growing support of the townspeople, truth would finally have its day in court. Back in her father's study, she carefully arranged the evidence in a leather portfolio, her hand brushing the tooled surface that still carried the faint scent of his pipe tobacco. The moon rose over the ranch, casting silver light through the window onto the scattered papers that held their hopes for justice. The church bell's deep tone rolled across Dry Ridge, each ring echoing off the weathered buildings. Nettie Jo stood before her mirror, fingers trembling as she slipped on her father's old ranch coat. The brown leather hung loose on her frame, but its familiar weight steadied her spirit. In the pocket, she felt the reassuring crackle of documents, their evidence against Trumbull's schemes. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows as people gathered in front of the Calhoun house. Sister Fawn stood with the 3 Apache elders, their faces solemn beneath wide-brimmed hats. Two Rivers nodded gravely to Nettie Jo, his weathered features showing quiet strength. Behind them, Preacher Maris adjusted his collar, clutching his worn Bible close. "Ready, child?" Miriam asked, pinning Nettie Jo's hair back with steady hands. "Yes, Mama." Nettie Jo squared her shoulders beneath the oversized coat. "Pa would have wanted us to stand tall today." They moved as one down Dry Ridge's main street, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust. More townspeople fell in behind them. The blacksmith who'd cut Bram's chains, farmers who'd suffered under Trumbull's lending schemes, mothers who remembered Nettie Jo's father's kindness during hard times. By the time they reached the town hall, their group had swelled to fill the street. Inside the makeshift courtroom, Oswald Trumbull sat at the front table, his silk vest gleaming in the lamplight. His smirk faltered as the crowd filed in, filling every bench and standing along the walls. Deputy Thorne shifted uncomfortably at his post by the judge's bench. Judge Harrison peered over his spectacles at the gathered assembly. "This hearing concerns the matter of Bram McKinnon, charged with assault and trespassing on railroad property." 2 deputies led Bram in, his wrists shackled. Despite a week in jail, he stood straight and calm, his eyes finding Nettie Jo's across the room. She clutched her father's coat closer, drawing courage from its familiar scent of leather and sage. "Your Honor." Nettie Jo stepped forward, her voice clear in the hushed room. "Before you pass judgment, I have evidence that speaks to Mr. McKinnon's innocence and Mr. Trumbull's true intentions." Trumbull's laugh cut through the air. "Judge, surely we're not entertaining the fantasies of a child." "Let her speak," called a voice from the crowd. Others murmured agreement. Nettie Jo spread her documents on the judge's bench. First came the treaty, its edges worn but text still clear. "This agreement, signed by my father and the Apache elders, binds our land and the sacred spring in trust between our peoples." She laid down the silver dollar receipt next. "This proves Bram McKinnon is legally contracted to work our land that Mr. Trumbull falsely claims as railroad property." Trumbull rose, his face reddening. "That scrap of paper means nothing against proper railroad deeds?" "About those deeds, Your Honor." Nettie Jo produced the evidence of forged signatures. "I've found proof that Mr. Trumbull has been falsifying documents. Look at these signatures, identical down to the last loop. No man signs his name exactly the same way twice." A rustle went through the crowd as the judge examined the papers. Preacher Maris stepped forward, opening his Bible. "If I may, Your Honor." The preacher's voice filled the room. "The good book speaks to this moment. Proverbs 16:11. Honest weights and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. Justice cannot be bought with silver, nor truth buried under false papers." The Apache elders moved forward as one. 2 Rivers spoke in his native tongue, Sister Fawn translating his measured words. "We were there when John Calhoun made his promise. The spring belongs to all people, not to men who write with forked tongues." Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly as he studied the documents. The room held its breath. Even the autumn wind seemed to pause outside the windows. "Mr. Trumbull," the judge said finally, "these allegations of forgery are serious matters requiring investigation." He turned to the deputies. "Remove Mr. McKinnon's shackles. I'm delaying any sentencing until these property claims can be properly examined." The sound of chains falling to the floor rang like victory. Bram rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Nettie Joe's face. Around them, the crowd buzzed with whispered conversations and relieved sighs. "This isn't over," Trumbull snarled, gathering his papers. But his usual confidence had cracked, showing the desperation beneath. "No, sir, it ain't," Nettie Joe agreed quietly. "Truth's like water. It finds its way out, no matter how deep you bury it." The townspeople pressed forward, examining the evidence for themselves. Hands patted Nettie Joe's shoulders, voices raised in support. Through the windows, the church bell tolled again, its sound now ringing more like hope than warning across the awakening town. Word spread through Dry Ridge like wildfire over the next 2 days. On porches and in the general store, townsfolk whispered about Trumbull's forgeries. The banker's carefully crafted reputation crumbled with each retelling of Nettie Joe's courthouse revelation. Bram's release came on a bright autumn morning. Nettie Joe waited outside the jailhouse with Sister Fawn, watching Deputy Thorne unlock the heavy iron door. Bram emerged, squinting in the sunlight, his weathered face showing relief at breathing free air again. "Much obliged for the bond money," he said quietly to Nettie Joe. She smiled, patting the pocket of her father's coat. "Weren't just me. Half the town pitched in their dollars." They rode back to the ranch together in the wagon, Sister Fawn following on her paint horse. The morning air carried a hint of frost, and fallen leaves skittered across the rutted road. At the ranch, Miriam had hot coffee and fresh biscuits waiting. Their peace lasted less than a day. The sound of approaching horses brought them all to the front porch before dawn. Trumbull led a posse of 6 men, including Sheriff Mills, their faces hard in the grey morning light. Behind them, dust rose from more riders approaching, but these weren't reinforcements for Trumbull. Townspeople on horseback and in wagons filled the road, blocking the posse's path to the ranch house. The blacksmith's broad shoulders stood out among them, along with Preacher Maris's distinctive hat. Even old Mrs. Henderson had come, her wagon loaded with her 5 grown sons. Trumbull's face twisted as he surveyed the crowd. "This is a legal eviction. Stand aside." "Legal?" The blacksmith spat in the dust. "Like them forged deeds you've been passing around?" Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, folks, let's not make this difficult." "It's already difficult." Sister Fawn's voice carried across the yard as she stepped forward. Her silver hair caught the rising sun like a crown. "This land has seen enough taking. The spring beneath feeds all our children, waters all our horses. The Creator did not draw lines in the earth. Men did that. And men can choose a better way." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Nettie Joe descended the porch steps, Bram a steady presence behind her right shoulder. She'd grown up hearing folks mock her size, but now she stood tall, feeling the weight of her father's legacy in every step. "Mr. Trumbull," she said, her voice clear in the morning quiet. "You came expecting to find one girl and a broken-down ranch, but look around you. This land ain't just dirt and water, it's people. People who remember my father's handshake meant something. People who know right from wrong." The crowd pressed closer, horses nickering softly. Trumbull's men glanced at each other, then at their boss. The banker's face had gone pale beneath his expensive hat. "Sheriff!" he snapped. "Do your duty!" But Sheriff Mills was counting the faces in the crowd, reading the resolve in their eyes. He'd grown up in Dry Ridge, knew these families. "Mr. Trumbull, sir, I reckon serving these papers right now would cause more trouble than it's worth. Best wait for the judge's full review." Trumbull's horse danced beneath him, sensing his tension. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he snarled. But his words carried no weight now. The power he'd built through fear and false papers was crumbling like autumn leaves. "Only mistake was thinking you could buy up all our dignity with your railroad money," someone called from the crowd. Faced with the wall of townspeople, Trumbull had no choice. He wheeled his horse around, nearly trampling his own men in his haste to retreat. The posse followed, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats and scattered laughter behind. Sister Fawn touched Nettie Joe's arm gently. Your father would be proud, child. You've reminded these people what it means to stand together." Bram nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Reckon some fights look impossible till folks remember they ain't alone." The crowd began to disperse, but not before several wagons unloaded supplies, food, timber, even a new water pump for the well. Nettie Jo stood watching them go, her heart full. The morning sun painted the ranch in gold light, promising a new day for all of them. 3 days later, a pair of territorial officials rode into Dry Ridge, their polished badges glinting in the morning sun. They carried leather satchels filled with audit papers and court orders. The town watched as they disappeared into Trumbull's bank office, emerging hours later with boxes of ledgers and forged documents. At the Calhoun Ranch, the sound of hammers rang out across the yard. Bram stood on the barn's new roof beams, driving nails with steady precision. Below, the blacksmith and his sons worked alongside Nettie Jo, passing up fresh planks. The barn's charred skeleton was disappearing beneath new wood, a testament to community strength. "Mind them splinters?" Bram called down to Nettie Jo, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there when she'd first cut that burlap sack from his head. Sister Fawn arrived with several Apache families, bringing fresh bread and stew for the workers. They gathered in the yard, sharing food and stories as the autumn sun painted long shadows across the grass. Nettie Jo stood before them, her father's coat now fitting her shoulders like armor. "This land," she announced, her voice clear and strong, "ain't just Calhoun land anymore. The spring water's meant for all our stock, just like my father intended. From now on, these pastures are open to any neighbor's herd that needs grazing." Sister Fawn nodded approvingly, and murmurs of appreciation rippled through the gathered families. Even Deputy Thorne, who'd come to deliver news of Trumbull's audit, smiled from his spot near the fence. Later, as sunset painted the sky in amber and rose, Nettie Jo found Bram by the corral. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses drink from the newly repaired trough. "Never thought a silver dollar could buy a family," Bram said softly, his eyes on the distant hills. "Reckon some things ain't about the price," Nettie Jo replied, her heart full of quiet joy. From the porch, Miriam watched her daughter standing tall beside the man who'd become more than a ranch hand. Her eyes misted as she remembered the townsfolk's cruel jokes about Nettie Jo's size and spirit. Now those same people looked to her girl for leadership, for wisdom about the land and its people. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and fresh-cut timber, promising tomorrow would bring another day of healing, both for the barn and for their growing family. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold. The morning dew sparkled on fresh-cut grass as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the Calhoun Ranch. The newly repaired barn stood proud against the backdrop of rolling hills, its fresh timber gleaming like honey in the early light. Nettie Jo stood on the porch steps, her heart swelling at the sight before her. Wagons and riders streamed through the front gate, bringing families from both town and reservation. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. Bram's tall figure moved easily among the crowd, helping set up tables for the pasture-raising bee. His once haunted eyes now held a quiet peace as he guided younger men in stretching wire fencing. Miriam arranged fresh-baked pies alongside Sister Fawn's traditional Apache flatbread, their shared work a symbol of two cultures meeting in friendship. Near the corral, tribal elders sat with town council members, sharing stories of seasons past. Their words bridged old divisions, weaving new understanding between peoples who'd once viewed each other with suspicion. Bram made his way to where Nettie Jo watched it all unfold. His shoulder brushed hers as he leaned against the porch rail. "Mind telling me again what you paid for me at that auction?" he asked, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Nettie Jo grinned up at him, her face bright with joy. "$1 silver," she said. "Best deal I ever made." Around them, the ranch bustled with shared purpose, Apache families driving cattle to fresh pasture, townspeople raising fence posts, children playing tag between the wagons. The morning air rang with hammers, laughter, and hope. Here, on this land her father had loved, Nettie Joe saw his dream made real. One community bound by courage, faith, and a single dollar's worth of defiance that had changed everything. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.